after listening to words, perspectives, and guidance by the University Bocconi, by other stakeholders as well. And some of the things they said are already relevant for the topics of our first session. I'm really thankful for being invited to open and introduce this part of the conference, and I'm sure that my colleagues will be very selfless and will be sticking to the allotted speaking times. So, in order to introduce our conference, please, I would like to dwell on some of the aspects of sustainable development. First of all, the fact that a sustainable development is based on an analytical approach that makes a link between social, economic, environmental, and cultural dimensions. This is a link that the encyclical by Pope Francis underlines. Secondly, sustainable development is a regulatory approach as well, because it tells us how things should be and not how they are now. And this idea is based on the notion of life quality and human dignity, wherever they come from and whoever they are. I'm convinced that life quality has more than one aspect to it, and it therefore requires a multidisciplinary approach. And in this context, we need to recognize that sustainability has a lot of different aspects and faces to it. One of the main topics in the encyclical by Pope Francis states that everything in the world is intrinsically linked. I would like to tell you that this encyclical is really fascinating for me from an intellectual point of view. This encyclical launches a challenge to both faithful and not faithful people, because it tells us that we all are citizens of a common home that is being plundered and where resources are being grabbed, where we are being deprived of a future. This planet is a world made of nature and culture that we have not inherited from future generations, but we have borrowed from our children. This is what an old, wise Latin American motto would say, and Pope Francis really likes this motto. I do too. From a theological point of view, the earth was there before we arrived on it, so it was given to us. Therefore, we need to be guardians of our world garden. This is a radical challenge, and this is a deeply social and ecologic encyclical which focuses on simplicity. Let us now come to the main topic, namely that everything in the world is deeply connected. In the fourth chapter, called An Integral Ecology, and the first part of the fifth chapter on orientations, the analysis of the world links is based on a study of the different aspects and dimensions of sustainability. This is a topic that I myself deal with as a scholar, because it is part of the research that our foundation has been carrying out on the many faces of sustainability. The reference to the many documents on sustainable development that the UN system has produced is also part of this encyclical. So we have a feeling that Pope Francis's idea are linked with the results of social and ecologic research on sustainability. It might be worth considering what Jeffrey Sachs said about it in The Age of Sustainable Development. Sachs claims that Sustainable development is an analytical approach, as I mentioned already, and it aims at understanding the meaning of interactions between complex systems, such as the global economy, the world society, and the natural environment. As a regulatory idea, sustainable development recommends a set of goals that we should aim to, both in theory and in practice, since we all live in this common home. As Sachs writes, sustainable development wishes economic progress to be spread in the world, it wishes extreme poverty to be wiped out, it wishes social solidarity to be encouraged through policies that increase community sense, and it wishes the environment to be protected from the degradation due to human activities. Sustainable development therefore proposes a holistic approach in whose framework a society aims to social or environmental and ecologic aims. Now, we know that the idea of sustainable development has a long track record, and it dates back to the Brundtland report from 1987. In the Brundtland report, sustainability was referred to the level of well-being of people in the long term. A sustainable development was a development that would support present needs without damaging future generations' needs. The same idea of sustainability was then discussed over time on the basis of more and more approaches and dimensions. Let us just think about the Rio summit in 1992, or let us just think about the Johannesburg United Nations meeting in 2002, or let us just refer to Rio Plus 20 in 2012. In that occasion, the General Assembly of the United Nations enriched the approach to sustainability using the world, this is the future we want. And then recently, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals were set out in the agenda for 2030. In the last century, the research about life quality began to gain pace, and it began to be based on an approach which is once again made up of different aspects. Some examples are Amartya Sen's works, or the quality of life. This is a publication by Amartya Sen from 1993, as well as other documents that all adopted and approved a series of criteria that is part of the United Nations Development Program as well. So, practices and theories that aim to sustainable development require that one fundamental basic condition is in place. Choices, decisions, practices must not be short-sighted, and the future should be taken in consideration in the present. The rights of future generations that the encyclical refers to can't even be discussed unless the condition I mentioned is in place. There's a big conflict between long-term and short-term, and Pope Francis dwells on it in his encyclical, and he says that environmental matters are more and more present in the public agenda, and now they are an invitation to think, an urge to think in the long term. Our obsession with short-sightedness dominates a big part of economy and finance. It dominates a big part of technology and policy and political or decisions. If the interest in people or the interest by political parties is a very short-sighted one, then the idea of sustainability collapses. And those who think about responsibility towards sustainable development are being contradictory because they do not act in a long-term, long-sighted way. The idea of sustainability means that we need to extend our reflections about the impact of our choices. We need the future to be more and more part of our present considerations. Pope Francis is even more right when he asks for global governments to answer to this urge to think in the long term. And he is right when he talks to us about the catastrophe of a policy that is focused on immediate results. And when he also criticizes the dominance of immediate economic return, of market which has become some sort of god and has no rules. So we need the future to be present now, and we also need to put ourselves in the places of other people. If we do not take care of the future, what we will be left with will be just a tribe with no future perspective, and not humanity, not mankind. Our common home would become wasteland, and this wasteland would become an eerie theatre where the masses would have hardships because they would live in a wasteland. Once again, one of the main principles of our encyclical is the importance of the links between things, and this is why taking up an ecologic integral perspective means engaging for justice and social equity as well. Only if we let the future flow in our present decisions, and only if we give up short-sightedness, then we can govern our global goods in a way which is appropriate, even in a very hard time. So the Pope urges us to take into consideration the situation in which social powers are being tread on by political power, and what we need is some sort of reform, some sort of intensive reform of international organizations, starting from the United Nations itself, which are now tainted by dubious transactions. Still, future and ecology require a multidisciplinary approach and perspective, and they require the ability to identify trade-off solutions, compromises between different interests, and conflicting interests in a common home. And it requires us to think in the long term, which in turn requires the existence of a public global space that everybody can access on an equal playing field. This is what the Laudato Si tells us. So all voices should be able to contribute so that step by step consensus and interaction can expand and find an agreement of the plural dimensions of human development. And Laudato Si is giving us a fundamental contribution to the same. Thanks.
Grazie.